Hello, I'm Joe Cartwright and welcome back to my studio. Today we're going to be tackling this beautiful rural scene. It features a lovely old shed, some grazing cows and a wonderful play of light through the trees. What I love about this subject is that it allows us to play with textures, from the rust on a corrugated roof to the soft golden light on the distant poplars. Throughout this demonstration, I'll show you how I simplify these complex shapes and how I use specific colour mixes to create warmth and depth in my landscape. We'll even look at some fun techniques like splattering water to create foreground texture. Now this is a comprehensive lesson, nearly 2 hours in total, but I didn't want to split it up into separate videos because I think it's important that you see the entire journey from the initial wash to the final details. Feel free to grab your favourite drink to enjoy while you watch along, but if you prefer to watch the video at a number of sessions, please do so. By the end, you'll have a much better handle on how to connect the foreground and the background into a really cohesive landscape. I'm going to wet the back, not the front, the back. And while that's sitting there, I'll now mix the colours we're going to use. I'll get some water. We've got a blue sky with a bit of warmth coming in from the left-hand side. Put some water into the palette. And then for the ground colour, with this got the sort of slightly dull green colour with areas of bright green. I'm going to have a little bit of orange into the sky, and that might do us for this stage. So I'm just going to use straight cobalt blue. And then I'll test that on a sheet of watercolor paper. And the way you test it is you press slightly and just drag the brush across. Okay, you don't pick up the paint and go dab like that. See how much darker it looks? As you drag the brush across, this is closer to what it's going to actually be on your paper. Okay, I'm going to make that a little bit stronger. And you make it stronger just by adding more paint, but no water. Leave that there, and then we've got cad orange. And then for the ground, I'm going to start with raw umber, because while there is some green there, there's a lot of brown as well. I'm now going to add some cobalt turquoise. I adjust the mixture here till I get a colour that I'm happy with. That'll do. Great. You know, and I think that's probably just a bit strong. The sky is normally the lightest part of your painting, so if you go too strong, everything else has to be even stronger still. So it's better to go too light than too strong with the sky. So now all I'm doing, I'm looking at the photo where I see some blue. I'm just using the side of my brush to create some interesting textures at this stage. But I'm leaving lots of gaps there for some of the foliage. Some of the foliage will also go over this blue, which means I'm going to need to soften some of these edges in a minute. And then down here, it's a bit lighter, so I'll add some water. That'll do. I'll come back and adjust that in a minute. Then I'll pick up the rest of my blue. And so my darkest blue is up the top here. Now I'm going to dip the brush in water and that'll start to dilute that mixture. Again here, I've got lots of foliage. If it was dull foliage, I'd paint through it, but because this is going to be quite bright, I don't want to paint through all of this foliage here. Now I'm going to clean my brush, pick up some of this cad orange, and I'll paint about an inch into that cobalt blue. And that just gives us a bit of warmth on this side. And then I'll just keep dragging that down. I've got a bright roof, so I'm going to paint around the roof. There. And a bright wall. This roof's in shadow, so we can paint through that. This cow's got some sunlight on it, so I'm not going to paint over the cow. We'll just run that down to ground level. And I'm just using my size 16 brush because it lets me cover a lot of the area quickly. That'll do. And then I'm going to clean my brush and I'm going to go up here and soften some of these edges. That way no hard edges will appear under the foliage that I don't want to be there. And it doesn't matter if this is tinted slightly with the blue, as long as there's a big contrast between the pure blue or the lighter areas. Might bring this down here. Now I've got this dull green colour here, but I see some brighter greens in the distance. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a brush load of this dull green, put it into a dry part of my palette, then pick up some aureolin and a little bit of the cobalt turquoise, and that will give me a brighter green. But because it's in the distance, I don't want it to be strong in tone, so I'll add a bit of water to it. So that will give me a lighter tone, but brighter green. And we're going to run that back here. And I've got some of this blue-grey colour from the sky beading at the bottom, and that's fine. That will just lighten that distant green a little bit further. Painting around the cows. Because the cows are a brown colour, the green will tend to dull them too much otherwise. A bit of green up here. Just a hint of it into the fence line. I'll pick up some of the dull green. Quick brush strokes. I want to leave some little bits of untouched paper, and they'll just add a little bit more life to the painting. Now I'm going to add some more raw umber, and this will warm the mixture up a bit and help bring the foreground further to the front. It might be a bit too strong, so I'm just going to add some more water to it. And vary the colour a bit. Just to break this up, because you know the ground here is not dead flat. And you can see how the colours are all merging down here, which is what I want. Now I'm going to pick up my size 8 brush, pick up some of this brown green colour, and I'm going to add some raw umber and some French ultramarine. Okay, so I've got this darker green, and I'm just going to splatter some paint to add a bit of foreground texture. And the main thing is to make sure your brush is not pointing upwards, otherwise you're going to get dots all over your sky. Just going to use a bit more burnt sienna here. And then I'll clean my brush, tap it a couple of times to take some of the water out, and I'm just going to splatter water. This will add some further texture. So now we're going to work on the hill in the background, the poplars and these trees. But I've got all this cobalt blue here, so there's nothing wrong with me just adding some French ultramarine straight into that, and then just adjusting it. But if you're starting from scratch, then just get French ultramarine, a little bit of permanent rose, and maybe just a hint of burnt sienna, not a lot. And let's test that. And it's got to be a stronger tone than the ground, so I'm going to add a bit more French ultramarine. So the colour was good, but the tone was too light. Let's go with that. It might be a bit strong, but I've already got quite a strong ground here, so I need to be stronger than that tone. So in my case, the stronger hill in the background is fine. And then the poplars, some of them have already lost their autumn leaves. So I'm going to make them a bit brighter than what's in the photo. And because I've got a bluish background, the complementary colour to blue is orange. So my poplars are going to be more of an orangey colour. I'm going to use one of my fan brushes. Again, get rid of some water, I don't need that much. And I'm just going to mix some cad orange and a little bit of cad yellow. And just a hint of raw umber, just so they're not super bright. What I'm going to do, I'm going to leave that there as a dull mixture. Then here, I'm just going to have cad orange and a bit of cad yellow. And that'll give me a brighter mix. I've got my blue colour. Again, we paint around the roof. You won't be able to see any of the hill down here because of all the foliage. A little bit of this hill colour back here. And then I can just see a hint of the hill here. And these I'm going to just soften just with the damp brush. And then here, where the poplars are, I'm going to very quickly just lift some of that colour. This lamppost. Not being too accurate about this. And then I'll go straight in with my cad orange and cad yellow mixture. It's going to be too strong. I'll go back in with this duller version. I don't want this to be that bright that the focal point becomes these trees. And I just dab up. Look at the tree and roughly follow their shape. Very quickly vary the gaps between them. Throw another one in there. And vary their height, just enough to make the shapes look a bit more interesting. That's a bit too solid. And then I'll go in with some of this brighter orange and cad yellow mix. And just drop in the odd section where the light hits the trees. Then I've got this burnt sienna mixture. I think I use that for the splatter that's darker. Add some more of the hill colour into it. And I'll grab just a rigger. So this is just French ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna. If this starts to dry too fast and I see cauliflowers, that's when I have to get my spray bottle out and give it a light spray to keep it workable. Just vary the colour a bit. Then down here we've got all this foliage and bushes. Get a size 8 brush. And I've got this dull green mixture. I'll start with that. Add some more cobalt turquoise and aureolin and a little bit of raw umber. Maybe a bit of this French ultramarine mix. And I'll paint into that hill while it's still wet. Leaving a bit of a highlight of the fence. Don't need to get too accurate with this. Vary the colour every now and then, maybe throw in a brighter green. Mostly the aureolin will do that. This is just going to be a massive dark lines for the fence later, so I don't have to be too accurate with it. That'll do. This is good. While that's still workable, I'm going to bring some of these poplars down because they have a darker area. The only thing I've got to be careful of is this edge here, because this is a relatively hard edge. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a bit more hill colour here. And then I'm just going to get my brush with clean water, take out about half to 3/4 of the water, and then just soften that edge. This way, when I come to paint the foliage, I won't get two dark colours overlapping each other and then giving me a bit of an outline. So that's the important thing there. I'm going to change this shape a little bit. For the greens, for the trees, normally if it's a big shape like this, I'll mix about 3 different shades of green. For the brighter green, I'll start with my aureolin or Windsor lemon, something like that. It's basically just a cool yellow. And then add a little bit of cobalt turquoise. And just a small amount of raw umber, just to dull that. And when I test it, you can see it's just way too bright. And it's also a bit too insipid looking, so I'm going to add more paint to increase its tone, which effectively means thicken the paint. No more water, just lots more paint. And it needs a bit more turquoise. And that's getting closer. But it's still too bright. So I'm going to add more raw umber, a little bit of French ultramarine. And that is getting closer to what we want. A little bit more raw umber. So the raw umber and French ultramarine move the green closer to a dull grey-green colour, which is more like what gum trees look like. I'm going to mix the darkest tones next. I don't need so much of it, so I'm going to just get rid of some of that water. Just a little bit of aureolin. I took away too much water. A little bit of aureolin and turquoise, but a lot more raw umber and French ultramarine as a ratio. Now we can take our time getting these colours right, because until we touch the paper with our paint, the clock hasn't started ticking. Test it, and while it's darker, it's not that much darker than this mixture here, so we'll add more French ultramarine. Great, that's better. And that gives me quite a nice contrast. And then the last thing I'm going to mix is just a brighter green still. And for that, just some aureolin, cobalt turquoise. And I'll use this to throw in a few additional highlights. And that's pretty good. So it's primarily aureolin cobalt turquoise with just a little bit of raw umber there. I'll leave that sitting there. Just give my paint a quick little swirl. I'm going to take out maybe about half of the moisture because I don't want it to be too drippy. So I want to keep some of the blue showing through, but I also want a fairly interesting pattern along this edge. I brought this foliage here to this side of the peak of the mountain. I didn't want it right at the peak. Now I've got some of this branch coming down this way. I'm going to just paint around that. That way preserve some of the white. You've got to paint this very quickly because where I've drawn these lines, you don't want that to dry. Run the paint over the edge and that just makes all the foliage look that much bigger. Great. Okay, now I'm going to go into my darker tones. And using the side of the brush to paint some of those in. And I make sure a lot of these are connected because the eye tends to follow similar tones. What you don't want is have a little dab of dark here, dab there, almost equally spaced, because the eye won't know what it's supposed to be looking at or where it should be going. Quite a bit of dark down here. And then just a hint, the odd dark up here. It's a bit too much. Now this is still workable, but it's just starting to stop flowing as much as I'd like. So I'm going to just give it a light spray. So I'm holding my spray bottle perpendicular to my painting and almost to the edge of where I want the water to go, and then I press hard so all the big droplets land over there and just the lightest ones land on my painting area. And the water droplets are attracted to the wet parts of the painting and they leave these dry areas dry. Now I'm going to pick up a little bit of this brighter green. I'm going to just drop this into the wet paint, especially in some of these darker areas, just as a little highlight. And we'll let those colours just flow into one another. Now I'm going to pick up my rigger. It's just a thin brush with maybe an inch of bristle on it. I'm going to pick up some of my dark green and add some burnt sienna to it. And that gives me a dull brown. Just vary the colour every now and then. And by painting these branches while the foliage is wet, you get a really nice connection. This shape here is a bit too much of a circle for my liking, so I'm going to break it up a little bit. Oops. Add a bit of cobalt blue to some of this to create more of a cool grey colour. And I'll get a small brush, maybe my size 8. You don't have to pick up this green, you could just use primarily French ultramarine and burnt sienna. Because you've got a massive green foliage here, you'd expect a little bit of green reflecting onto the lighter coloured foliage anyway, so there's nothing wrong with picking up the green and adding it to it. Just lighten this side. And when you bring the tree down to the grass, don't just paint a flat shape there. If you look at the photo, you'll see how there's dark areas and lighter areas. And where it hits the ground, it's an irregular shape. Darken this side. Too dark, I'll just lighten that a bit. I'm going to just put a dark side to this branch. And in a minute I'll tint that white area so it's not quite so stark. some trees in the distance. And I'm going to mix just a tiny little puddle of a weak mix of cobalt blue and burnt sienna. And I'm setting this up so that when I do my shadow across here, I'll paint around some of these sort of folded shapes where the foliage is sort of dipped down into the ground. Let me just darken this area a little bit. And even a rigger is quite useful for creating texture. Here I'm going to put in a branch. I'm going to lift some highlights on this trunk here. Same with this one here. Let's work on this area while this tree continues to dry. Alright, so for this building, I'm going to get some cobalt blue, just very weak cobalt blue. And just a tiny touch of burnt sienna. I've got a little bit of green, so I've just picked up a tiny touch of permanent rose just to grey that off. And we'll let that sit there for a bit while I work on this fence. The fence is quite a small shape, so I'm going to paint that with my size 8 brush. And for that, just some cobalt blue and burnt sienna. Maybe a bit stronger. Leave little highlights. We've got some sort of horizontal lines going through this way. And then for the little wagon, I'm just going to pick up some burnt sienna. Now I've picked up some burnt sienna along with, but I didn't wash my brush because I already had this blue-grey colour in my brush. Picked up the burnt sienna and that gave me a slightly dull brown that hopefully will read like rust. I don't want to try and make that too detailed because I really can't see very much detail there anyway. They're just little squiggles and the hints of the wheels are enough to say, yeah, there's some sort of mechanical contraption there. And that will do. Lamppost while I'm here. Again, just some cobalt blue and burnt sienna. And that gives you a nice cool grey colour. That'll do. Okay, now, while I'm still waiting for the roof to dry, I'll get some burnt sienna, a little bit of French ultramarine, just to produce a dull brown. Okay, I've got to be a little bit careful here because this is still wet. In a way, I think I got away with it because it's that wet that most of the paint's flowing down the paper. I should have dried it first. But because this area is still wet, it's automatically lightening that top of the cow. I'd like to say I did that on purpose. We'll call that a genuine happy accident. And there's grass all around the cow, so again, just like the trees, where their hooves hit the ground, you want that to be a bit more of a broken edge. There we go. Some raw sienna, and while I've been talking, this paint has sort of been settling on the paper and it's staining the paper, so that when I go in with some raw sienna in a minute, while some of that paint will flow into the light areas, you'll still see that edge almost hinted at rather than as a sharp edge. And that's good enough. Get rid of that. Oops. And there's a sunlit part of this cow. I'm going to just paint that in like that. Doesn't have to be a sharp edge. There we go. It could be a bit darker. There we go. Let me go and dry this. All right, now we can finish up the shed. And we're going to put some rust on the shed. So just some burnt sienna, a little bit of French ultramarine, maybe a bit stronger. Now just a hint of Scarlet Lake, I think. Just a very light flick. This one goes this way. Now, I haven't dried all of this. I mainly dried this area, so I've got to be careful where my fingers go. The rust is handy for creating a sharp edge somewhere you might want it. In this case, to create that separation between the green foliage and the red of the rusty building. Just get some burnt sienna and French ultramarine. Little flick with the brush. Let me zoom in on that. And you can see how I've just a little flick like that, and I've left some bits of white showing through as glimpses into the other side of the building, and maybe even looking into the distance. Here we can't see a lot as to what's happening. There's definitely some vertical shapes, and also there's a dull grey in there. We'll dry that in a minute. We've also got a little rectangle down here in the brickwork. I'm going to add some rust here. Don't want this to be as strong, however. And the brickwork, just some raw umber added to some of this weak rust colour. And again, at this edge, keep it a little bit broken because there'll be grass along there. Just makes it look a bit more natural. I'm going to say that this wall runs along the front as well, even though I can't see it. So I'm going to add a little bit of that on this side. So this is at the back and this is on the side. Now this is dried enough that I can go in. Drop in a bit of burnt sienna in there as well, because there is what looks like some machinery or something. And then underneath the eaves, a little bit of a darker area, so we'll just run a dark line through there. All right, now I'm going to dry that because we've got to put in the strong shadow and a few little details. So let me dry that. For our shadow colour for the building, it's going to be some French ultramarine and a little bit of permanent rose. To create a purple colour, and I'll add a little bit of burnt sienna into it too. Really I already had sitting here from my rust mixture. So a slightly bluish purple. This is too light. Get a bit of dirty cobalt blue. Now we've got the shadow cast by these posts. We've got a soft shadow, so obviously there's a tree over here somewhere casting a shadow on this building. So what I'm going to do, just get some clean water, and these are soft shadows, so I'm going to wet this and this. Back of this building is all in shadow, so I'll just paint that. Just a quick glaze over that building. Just leaving a few little areas of light. When that dries, I'll go in and put in some darker shapes there as well. Paint in some of these shadows. I just don't have anywhere near enough shadow mixture here, so rather than continuing to fiddle with a small amount of shadow mix, I'm going to mix a lot more shadow while I'm waiting for this area to dry. So a big dollop of water. So French ultramarine, a little bit of permanent rose, a little bit of burnt sienna. Just a bit more of burnt sienna, I think. Back area has a stronger shadow in it, so I'm going to darken it some more. And then there's darker areas in the corrugations where the corrugated iron starts to lift. Something like that. Another one here. So now in the distance, I've got my shadow colour. The shadow I've mixed is the strength I'm going to need here. For this distant area, I'm just going to pick up some of this paint, drag the brush through the edge of the palette to take out about half the moisture, and then dip the tip of my brush in water, and that will dilute it. Maybe diluted it too much in this case. Quick brush strokes. And then I'll get my fan brush and just break up some of that edge, just to hint that there's grasses there. And now we've got this big shadow across here. But if we look at the shadow, the things you've got to keep in mind, so what have we got within this shadow? We've got these tufts of grass, some of them are brighter and some are darker. So the brighter ones, we're going to create them with a fan brush by painting the shadow shape, okay? We also have some areas that are a bit indistinct. So while we've got a reasonably defined edge in the distance, in here, obviously this shadow is being cast by some big tree. We've got areas where some of the light filters through to different varying extents. So you get some soft edges, and then you've got the sharp edges where the grass is sort of silhouetted against the background. We're not just going to paint one big wash across here. By the way, there's still little details I can do on this building. I'm not going to worry about that just yet. I'm going to pick up my size 12 brush, clean water, tap it a couple of times, and here and there, not too regular, I've dabbed some water. That's all. Maybe a little bit here and there too. Then I'll pick up my shadow colour. Then I'll come back down here. And we've got some softer edges, so I'm going to just soften some of these. I'm going to give that a light spray. I'll get my fan brush. Then I've got some green for the grasses. I'm going to come up this way. It's drying too fast. which means that I've got to use a spray bottle to keep this area workable. And this distant edge, I'm going to break that up because there's grass there, but the distant grasses are shorter than these ones in the foreground. Same here, this edge is too sharp. Sometimes I'll just dab it, and that's good enough to break up that edge. Then we've got this dark green, and use quite thick paint. So it's a leftover from the dark here. Vary the colour a bit. And I want the lighter green in areas where the sun's likely to hit it. I'm going to get some raw umber for this grass. And then even these brighter grasses will have a little shadow here and there. Probably irrelevant putting too much too close to the edge because you would crop that out when you're framing it. This is slowly drying. I'll get some of this almost pure raw umber. Add some French ultramarine to it, it's a bit too light. This is damp paper, so I'm using quite thick paint. Otherwise, if my paint's too weak or too watery, it'll create little cauliflowers. Maybe a slightly weaker mix. Too weak. It's always better to bring your grasses up from below, otherwise you get a little flat top on them. So drag it upwards. And all I'm doing here is just making sure I don't have too sharp a transition between the lit area and the shadow area. You want to make these two shapes look like they're connected somehow. Let me just dry that because I want to put some of the corrugations on there. So I'm not trying to draw in every corrugation, but enough to sort of say, yes, the corrugated. This was just a bit too dark. Let's throw in a couple of birds. I'm going to darken one side of this post. So this tree here would have a shadow coming across here. So let's put that in. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me out a lot. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.